first brown bag of the new academic year. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Igor Istomin. He is a lecturer at MGIMO, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. When I taught there in 2008, he was my teaching assistant in a course on US-Russian relations, and we kept in contact and worked together since then. A lot of his work that he's done in Russia has been on the role of US think tanks in the making of US foreign policy, but he's also now working on and looking at the role of Russian think tanks and the Russian expert community in Russian foreign policy. So we're delighted to have you.
Running a bit late. I mean, well, it's still confusing me. The Washington in general, and also a bit Georgetown University, which is a great university, of course, but you have so many buildings and the campus is so diverse. So yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Stent for this wonderful opportunity. I mean, already for a number of years, as far as I know, that at least starting from your visit in 2008, we have, I think, flourishing relationships, and Professor Stent organizes video conferences every. Yeah.
Have a video conference with your students.
Yes, and so it's great to have students on different parts of on different sides of the ocean and still communicating and discussing real problems. And we also have this conference in summer, which is also a great event. So I think I have a lot of, when I said that I'm coming to CERES, I had a lot of people asking me to say thank you and to send greetings to Professor Stent. So today I would like to speak a bit about the role of Russian foreign policy experts, how they view the Russian-American relations, but even not so much Russian-American relations, but in general how they view foreign policy, how they view the role of Russia in the current world, and what are the general guidelines that they are providing for the leadership, what are the general strategies and proposals. And I mean, the idea of this talk, I think, comes from the well-documented puzzle of foreign policy making, that those who do policy, decision makers so to say, that they tend to overemphasize their internal problems within their country, but in the same time they they tend to oversimplify those countries that they are dealing with. Their viewing is like kind of, you know, hard ball, billiard ball, and it just isn't true, in fact, and that's part of the problem which creates then problems in relations. So I think we all have seen once again throughout the last few weeks how diverse and complicated decision-making process in the United States is. Well, now we'll try to think a bit about how Russian foreign policy is cooked. And I think it's the same true with Moscow. I mean, in Moscow there is also, I think, not enough appreciation of what's going on within Washington, what are the problems that the president and the administration faces inside the country, and this is kind of on the both sides of the aisle, I would say. So taking advantage of that, we are now in this academic environment. I will start with the more basic issues facing Russian foreign policy, and then if you have questions, and I will be happy to answer on more pressing questions and pressing issues of today, if you'd like to. So I would proceed, I think, to start with a few words. What does we actually mean when we speak about expert community and experts and their role in the foreign policy? Then proceed to identify major motivations behind Russian foreign policy, and what could be called Russian foreign policy identity. And from this we'll be able to look at what Russian expert community has to say and the dominating approach of Russian foreign policy thinking. So why does the title focus specifically on foreign policy experts? As I said, the internal debate, which is both here in Washington and in Moscow, it occurs on many levels, and it doesn't include only decision makers. It doesn't include only institutions where foreign officials, where officials speak. It also includes business, NGOs, society, right? But the role of expert community is crucial in this process, and is crucial for understanding of this process, why it's this expert community which articulates alternative approaches to national foreign policy, conceptualizes them, and then translates into specific policy proposals. And you probably have seen already how through the beginning of our discussion I've avoided the word think tanks. I would say that it's hard to compare American think tanks with their Russian counterparts. It's just different kind of creatures. But the one thing they are doing the same, they're trying to analyze what's going on in the world, and they try to provide their leadership with some kind of advice. Now, it's eventually, of course, decision makers which make the decisions, and very often they are quite far, the decisions are quite far from the proposals made by colleagues in think tanks or Russian institutions. And even more, it's not even always clear who impacts whom, right? Sometimes experts are just kind of communicators which translate ideas from the foreign policy makers to the broader audience. But still, anyway, the discussion within the foreign policy expert community, by default, it describes what's going on in the black box, and it's much easier to understand through looking at this community what's inside the black box is going. Otherwise, they won't be relevant, and okay, they will be out of jobs. So, with all these disclaimers in mind, let's move on to identify the current state of the foreign policy debate in Russia. And many of you are probably aware that Russian foreign policy discourse and Russian thinking about foreign policy is not only about foreign policy and international relations. It is as much about thinking of what Russia is in itself. There are still a lot of even historical unsettled issues which dominate in Russian society, and the fact that they are not resolved, it affects the thinking of decision makers. Yes, throughout the last decade, we went over this big debate which was very much defining Russian intellectual landscape in the 90s and 20s and the beginning of 2000s, the discussion on so-called Russian idea, right? I think the discourse now is getting much more practical and pragmatic, and it's more about the issues, but still this kind of unresolved dilemmas and unresolved commitments to various parts of Russian history still sits behind in these discussions from time to time. However, I think the cornerstone of Russian foreign policy identity in the world is already emerged and is recognized, and it's kind of consensus in the Russian foreign policy elite. And this is the consensus about that Russia cannot allow itself to withdraw from the table where rules of the games are set. It sounds a bit kind of grandeur, but it's kind of a reflection on very practical things we are dealing with. And today I think this is the bottom line on which everyone agrees in the expert community. I think there is also part of the consensus is that even not everybody explicitly is ready to admit this. Implicitly, there is an understanding how much, not just how much Russia is affected by external environment and how dependent it from its environment, but it also recognition that resources that that country possesses are not adequate to the international challenges it faces. And in the way the collapse of the Soviet Union, even, I mean, frankly speaking, it was long ago, yeah, but it still reinforced concerns about this dependency from the outside world. If the Soviet Union was so dependent from the international community, what's going on then with Russia, which is smaller and not as powerful as the Soviet Union used to be. Due to its history, Russia still perceives itself in extremely vulnerable in the very competitive environment, and the environment is getting more competitive as the new major powers enter the stage, like China, like India, like Turkey, for example. It is maybe still underappreciated in Russia, but there is growing appreciation and recognition how Turkey is certain to be one of the major players. So what is often explained by outsiders as so-called great power politics is to much extent from the inside seen as really defensive maneuvering to secure Russia's voice in the international decision-making, in which not everybody wants to listen to Russia. And from these basic propositions, however, emerge a set of various approaches, and quite different approaches actually, to the Russian foreign policy, struggling to provide an answer to the diverse challenges that Russia faces. And those approaches can be attributed to the different parts of the Russian society, to the different parts of Russian foreign policy elite and political elite. Political elite is not united, and different parts of expert community who attempt to articulate these approaches. And the diversity is of course very rich and it's very broad, but I will try to focus on three major approaches and three major visions of the foreign policy which kind of dominate the landscape. The one I would call, and the names are conventional, so you can find them in different different authors, you can find different names, but I think most of those who write or speak about Russian foreign policy approaches and visions of its strategy, they recognize about this same kind of groups. So one is liberal internationalists, the other I would say call conservative eurasianists, and the third realists, which is the most simple, to sound more simple. The trick of course here, and I just now realized that while talking about this to the American audience, it is very complicated because liberalism and conservatism in Russian political tradition is quite different from what you expect here. Taking internal political agenda, conservatism is in the United States is market decides everything and the invisible hand and all this. In Russia, conservatism is big state, and state should provide services, support people, help them, all this kind of stuff. And vice versa, liberalism for Russian understanding, and in Russia, liberalism is a kind of viewing that more market, more kind of freedom for individual expression, and more opportunities. So it's completely the opposite from what you are seeing here in the United States, but it is also part of our historical, and we can discuss if you are interested why it is so. And I also would like to speak about certain misconceptions that emerge about these kind of groups in both inside Russia. There is also certain misconceptions about this. And so let me start with the liberal internationalism and what it is and what are the misconceptions about liberal internationalism. The basic thought behind liberal internationalism, despite all internal divisions and discussions, is that as Russia is so much dependent from the outside world, it needs to engage at most this outside world and to integrate extensively and rapidly in the global economy, in international institutions, and of course part of it is advancing relations with the Euro-Atlantic communities, with the United States being the core of this global economy and global institutions. And since it is seen not as the kind of cooperation with the Euro-Atlantic community, integration is not good as in itself. It is seen as a source to overcome existing technological and institutional backwardness, to advance economy and advance society, and to achieve broader social goals. So it's purpose-oriented approach. And of course, you probably know, many of you had Russian courses on Russian, you have understand that this type of approach has its roots in deep historical debates in the 19th century, Zapadniki and so on and so forth. And this is the logic of modernization through adaptation of Western achievements and going forward from this. And then this led to certain serious misunderstandings of the state of the liberal internationalism in Russia. Since a lot of pundits and a lot of journalists are talking how Russia, American and Russia, Western relations are bad, it is supposed to be that partly it is because liberal internationalism is in decline in Russia. And the conception, the big myth and the big explanation is that there was shiny beginning of the 1990s, when with Minister of Foreign Affairs Kozyrev, it was kind of, they were the leading figures in Russian. They were shaping the Russian foreign policy, and then sorry, the devices, I'm not sure I can handle them properly, but you cannot do without them. So it is seen that since then liberal internationalism is in decline. Well, in practice, I would say that liberal experts, they continue to be a huge part of the Russian expert community. Maybe the biggest part of the Russian expert community are still liberal internationalists. And they still relevant for policymakers, and they still affect policymaking. But remember what I started with, that liberal internationalism doesn't see the relations with the outside world on its own. It is the source to promote internal agenda. And so while this naive version of liberal internationalism, which was present in the beginning of the 90s, this idea of how it was called in Russia, democratic solidarity, that we are now a democracy as well, and all democracies are together, and we are kind of on the same side always, and the interests of the West are the interests of Russia, as once was said by certain Russian politicians. this, of course, disappeared. And what emerged as the leading way of Russian liberal thinking is more sophisticated and more complicated way of thinking about relations with the international environment. And for example, in recent publications and speeches of one of the most prominent representatives of liberal internationalism, Alexei Arbatov, I hope you have chance to read some of his articles. He is really prominent thinker both in the Institute of World Economy and in Moscow Carnegie Center, and he's great expert on, for example, on arms control. But in his recent speeches, he is very frank about certain questions that both during the President Yeltsin's era and both President Putin's era emerged about the behavior of the United States. And he says that there were some steps done by Russia which didn't find some kind of response in the United States and in Europe, and this led to the kind of deterioration of relations, partly, of course. But the main, I think, this is kind of a sign that the Russian liberal internationalists, they are becoming more critical about the situation. However, this major idea that in the long run, the relations with the West are still key to the further development of Russian society and Russian economy, still drives this part of the experts community. Though, and for example, we can take Sergei Karaganov, who is another prominent Russian expert, and I think yesterday he had birthday. Yeah. So he was director of Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, and he's still dean of World Politics Department in the high schools of economics. So he, in recent publications, he is writing a lot about the need to advance relations with China, the need to supplement relations with the West with the relations with China and other Asian states. So the vision of Russian internationalists becoming more complicated. But what is striking is that liberal internationalists remain to be the best institutionally organized group. So I already mentioned few of the organizations of think tank, if you'd like, which represent this liberal internationalists, where they dominate. I would say that recently created Russian Council on Foreign Affairs is as much representative of this liberal wing of Russian foreign policy expertise. And this is, I mean, other dimensions which I would continue to speak in a bit. They do not have this institutional base, and they do not have maybe even that kind of support also from the external. There is also Moscow Carnegie Center, which is offspring of the American institution, and so on and so forth. And the example, one of the clear examples how these experts remain relevant is, for example, the latest Russian foreign, it's not called foreign concept of on foreign affairs, foreign policy concept. Yeah, well, it's basically foreign policy strategy. It emerged in February 2013, and what is striking is how much emphasis is done on soft power. And they said that soft power to be the core of Russian instruments dealing with the foreign policy, which is something, for example, director of the Russian Council on Foreign Affairs had advocated for some years already. Igor Ivanov, he was just Minister of Foreign Affairs a few years, I think, ago already, a lot of years ago already. And he is the head of this council. But he was advocated severely, and I mean, he was quite active about this idea of soft power. And then it's in the concept of foreign strategy of foreign affairs. The major political person from political elite is directed to advance this soft power instruments, so-called Россотрудничество. Kosachev, who is one of the major people in the Russian foreign policy elite, he was made the head of this agency, which before was completely small and was technical, and now the leading foreign policy figure. And funding is allocated to this agency as well, which, for example, Ministry of Finance was really outrageous because it managed foreign affairs assistance, and now it's all transferred to this new agency. So there is kind of development here. But of course, the Russian liberal internationalists, they have their alter ego, and this is kind of the people from the other side, and those who I call conservative eurasianists, which are much more suspicious about the West, and primarily because it sees West as in the driving seat of these international institutions, and their concern is primarily the opposite. They are saying we are too dependent on international affairs. Let not rush to be even more dependent from international reality. Let's stop some time, let's think, let's try to manage our engagement, involvement, integration in the international economy. And for example, this was represented in the debate on the WTO accession when the prominent Russian economist Sergei Glaziev said, well, we are not ready to be part of the WTO. Let's stop here. Let's wait until we will be ready and we have industrial base. Otherwise, we'll be producing just oil and gas. And I mean, this could help. This is the kind of argument these conservatives say. They say this could help in the short term to acquire economic growth, but it will undermine long-term development perspectives, long-term development coming from this oil dependency to more technologically advanced and diversified economy. So this is part of their argument. And of course, this part of the Russian expert community are very much discussed even in the United States. I described already, Professor Stan, how a few days ago I had a chance to visit one of the conservative, in American understanding, conservative foreign policy think tank here in Washington. And they were trying to speak about the Russian-American relations, and they tried to prove their argument about this deterioration of relations using the words of these representatives of the conservative camp. And you could hear there, you wouldn't hear there about Arbatov, you could hear there about Prokhanov, Glaziev, Narochnitskaya, all those kind of people who are saying the same kind of things about the American foreign policy. When they speak about the American foreign policy, they say, okay, listen to McCain, listen to Graham, and you see they say that Russia is evil. What kind of sincere relations we could have with them? So it's they are on the very opposite extremes, but it's kind of magnetizing them, bringing them together in a way. And I think it's very kind of circle where they help each other. I mean, I think they should have some kind of discussion, or I don't know, have common strategy. But yeah, this is kind of important part. But when I speak about conservative part of Russian foreign policy experts, I would like you to have a deep breath first of all, and then to realize that there are also two kind of conservative experts in Russia. One is this high-profile advocacy-oriented pundits, which are very vocal, very loud, and they are very active in this endeavor. And they very much use this anti-Western rhetoric to advance their cause. I would say that they are important in terms of rhetoric, but they are, I'm not sure that they have real impact on the substance of the Russian foreign policy. They are viewed more on the rhetorical side. The substance, those who deal with the substance, I think they are less eager to listen to this kind of voices. But on the other hand, within these conservative communities, there are plenty of wonks sitting in the institutes of Russian Academy of Sciences and writing important articles and papers, advancing not this extreme version, but more also nuanced and sophisticated version, similar to what we could see with liberal internationalism. And what the basic claim is the same. Russia is not ready for full-fledged engagement in the international community. We need to have some kind of more nuanced policy towards it. We need to have some kind of arrangements protecting against certain risks which emerge. And they say, look, for example, at the EU countries, the West European countries. They managed to get better in the international economy through getting this European Union, which is kind of also a protective layer for all these West European countries and helping them to be competitive internationally. So one of the ideas which came from this part of the community is, of course, the ideas of the customs union, of the Eurasian economic community, and what is proposed to be negotiated until 2015 is Eurasian Economic Union, which maybe I mentioned, maybe not. And this is kind of idea of pooling resources together in a format where Russia would enjoy leadership, cooperating with neighboring countries to get kind of to the international community together. And so this is kind of, for example, is very present in the Russian relations with the European Union, because there was much talking among journalists of how the Eurasian Economic Union is distracting from the path toward Euro-Atlantic cooperation and to the European Union. Well, most of the Russian experts who are doing on this, I think they would not put this on the opposite side. Quite the contrary. And it's not even Russian expert. The president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, said that Eurasian Economic Union is our way to Europe. Because what is, I mean, I think most of the countries in the CES would like to have better access to the European market and better relations. But look what is proposed by the European Union. They have this wonderful idea how they view the relations with the post-Soviet countries. They proposed, we can share with you everything but institutions, which sounds nice, right? What does it mean? We would like to propose our fine norms and regulations. You could look at them, we can discuss them, and then you adopt them. And all the decision making, okay, we will do it ourselves. That's what it's about. If you say share everything but decision making, right? So this is kind of concern which drives this conservative part of the Russian society as well, Russian expert community as well, and conservative part of Russian society as well. Though I'm not sure that they are have much nuanced view of these proposals. So the idea is to have these negotiations first of all with the European Union from the better perspective, from the more powerful kind of position. And this is kind of important. And now I think that I have to go to the conclusion, but I just would like to say a few words about realists, as we promised, because realists tend to look the least confusing, because realists, what you can say, they are seeming to be somewhere in the middle ground, right? They're trying to find something some path between these two competing views. But also, realism. The problem with realism is always that it's difficult to realism to construct, to preserve a certain strategic vision, because realism tend to be very pragmatic, and pragmatism is very good on the one hand, but on the other hand, what are your strategic goals? Where are you going in the long run? And maybe this is part of the problem we have with realists. Just they need to take from other perspectives certain parts to create their own long-term vision. But at the end of the day, they share understanding both of the risks of dealing with the United States and other Western partners, and they share the idea of that it's inevitable to have more engagement of Russia in the international sphere. So one of the ideas for them is to diversify relations and to put more emphasis on cooperation with, for example, BRICS countries, but not only BRICS countries, because, for example, when we have a Russian foreign policy debate, Russian debate on relations in Asia Pacific, there is a lot of saying now that we need to diversify in Asia Pacific. We are too focused on China. We need to kind of refocus us less on China, more on South Korea, more on Vietnam, more on other countries in the region, because we also become here too much dependent on one country, as we have too much dependent in general on relations with the West. So this is part. And one major concern behind the realist thinking is, and they share it with the kind of eurasianist view, is that the kind of being taken for granted, and this is kind of concern which I think drives Russian foreign policy, and it's kind of cross-cutting all other spheres. Everybody has to explain how to construct relations with the West, but also with other partners, with China as well, without being taken for granted, without being presupposed that you will agree on something. And this is kind of legacy we take from the 1990s, I think, when to many extent of Russian views, I only partly agree with this. I think that there were a lot of just necessity in what was done, but to much extent it is seen like the Dark Ages, when everybody you have accepted everything, and those you're cooperating with, they tend already to take it that they assume that you will agree on everything, and when you say first that you disagree, it is much more complicated for you to prove it, because then what's happened. So I know that for the maybe more than a decade and a half, it is not already that, and Russia is seen as kind of very very complicated partner for the United States. But for the Russian perspective, there is this trauma of being too easy to agree, and then finding that not always your interests are appreciated. I think this is kind of drives Russian foreign policy thinking. So finally, I would like to say that the real foreign policy is kind of combination, is kind of mix, not even a salad, but just a soup from all these approaches. And then I think I talked too long, so I'd be happy to take questions if you have time still.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting. Of course, the questions with today's New York Times op-ed piece by President Putin, which is, of course, an example of really the changing Russian tone. There are a number of things in the article that are very interesting, but one I just want to bring up because it comes back to your question of Russian identity and the discourse about what Russia is. On the one hand, we've heard from Mr. Putin and other people around him for some time, Russia has its own civilization, it's different from the United States, it's a unique civilization, and therefore we in the Europeans shouldn't be trying to impose our values and civilization on Russia. But today in the article, Mr. Putin accused the United States, or he quoted President Obama from his speech saying that the US was exceptional, and Putin said, no, the US isn't exceptional, and no country can call itself exceptional. So how do you reconcile this? Do you think that the image that Mr. Putin and some of the other officials around him and some of the people you've talked about, the foreign policy thinkers are trying to propagate, is of Russian exceptionalism? Or is it more to say, no, no country is exceptional and therefore refuting US exceptionalism?
I have to disclaim that I would tend myself to see as more realist in a way, just to kind of oppose me. And I think that, you know that there was a lot of writing in Russia, and there is still a lot of writing about these old conceptions of unipolarity, unipolar world, and America-centric world, Pax Americana, and all this. And this is kind of perceived by most part of the community as very badly. And this is precisely because of this kind of idea that you would like to sit at the table. Now, the United States, at least at some point, they thought that they could be the only guys at the table, at least in the Bush era. Russia doesn't have this opportunity even to pretend it could think of being the only one. But it also sees that, realistically thinking, there is a group of countries which could become, as both have the capacity and also have the desire to participate in this collective decision making about the world. And so, in this term, Russia doesn't seek exceptionalism. Well, of course, Russia views itself as an exceptional civilization, but I think every country sees itself as an exceptional civilization. I'm not sure about some Kiribati, Fiji, but otherwise, and I don't want to offend those countries, but I just don't know anything about them, and just my guess. But I do think that from the foreign policy perspective, that the idea is that we need to have this kind of discussion, and the place where we could have this discussion kind of physically, materially, is in the United Nations. I don't know if I answered the question.
That's fine, great. Questions, comments from the audience?
Liberal interventionist, conservative, Eurasian, and realist. Would it be fair to say that Russia's role in the events in Syria is of a realist nature, just to stick up, like not to miss an opportunity to be in the face of the United States? Or should we interpret it as, liberal interventionists say Russia wants to handle matters through international norms, using the international community, rather than just wanting to be in the face of the United States in every matter nowadays?
Thank you for your question. I think that I think this kind of events are the most challenging for the liberal internationalists. For the other two frameworks, they are less challenging. And I don't think that realist thinking, they are only thinking...
Try to be to focus more on this aspect. But I think what realists, and actually most in the foreign policy elite, and I think Putin is very clear in saying this, the major concern is security. And the major concern, taking you Iran, take you Syria, take Afghanistan, is what will happen with the radical jihadism. This is the lenses through which Russia views this region, because there is an understanding that it could be a spillover to the Central Asia, to the Northern Caucasus, and to the even to regions in the central Russia. And this could be, I mean, now the major security threat to Russia is not the United States. It's not China. The major security threat to the Russian Federation is radical Islamist movement. And I put aside Islam as a religion. I mean these guys with automats and everything. So these guys with machine guns, but also these guys with, of course, with the pens, because the word could be as explosive as the bomb. So and Russia kind of very unsure what will happen with Syria, knowing what happened with Libya, with the knowledge what happened in Iraq, with the knowledge what happened in Afghanistan, and with the knowledge what we have done on our own soil in Chechnya in the 90s. I think all this knowledge instructs that the order comes first, and you have to guarantee this order. And this is just next door to you, so you cannot, avail yourself to this kind of risks. Yeah, please.
In the wake of Libya and kind of this feeling that Russia was going to use the international community, at least its power connection, did the whole interventionists or the people that the experts in this for that kind of lose ground in general foreign policy in the world in Russia and was kind of, did they kind of lose it, kind of get closer to
Well, I would say that it is seen in Russia to much extent that the Libyan decision was not quite right, and that this was a blank check, and we shouldn't illusion ourselves that this will be a limited operation and so on and so forth. That was seen as for example, mistake by the foreign policy of the president at the time. But I don't think it have overwhelming effect on everything. I mean, they are present. They are everywhere. I mean, the people thinking of from this perspective, they are really a huge part of the community, and their expertise is very valuable in terms of technical terms. For example, in arms control, which is, I think, it is understandable from political point of view why people from arms control tend to be often liberal, because the same as in the United States, arms control lobby is kind of more seen Russia better than, for example, people who deal with other issues, because they know these people, they work with them closely they write here and they go here and so for example in this area you cannot go without these people, and when it comes to the specific policy issue, I mean, you don't have anyone. I mean, you have people with some other perspectives, but these are just among the main, and the core group is liberal internationalism and arms control experts. Yeah.
You just mentioned how the U.S.-Russian relationship is complicated for the last 10 years, and if you were advising the Obama administration, what is the top one thing that the U.S. is missing out in its relations with Russia? What is the one understanding from your knowledge of how this foreign policy decisions or policies made in Russia? What can you tell the Obama administration to better look at or take into account?
It's a tricky question. Maybe I will not
how to say it? But now probably. So maybe I wouldn't agree with myself in some time, but what's come to me now at the top of my head is not to emphasize and not to politicize human rights issues, because it's kind of, you know, blames. It is always seen as the United States teaches others what to do. You know, you don't like to be taught what to do. You could have dialogue on those issues, like the initial proposal on the working group by McFall and civil society, and there was discussion, maybe not on the very topic the United States would like to discuss, but there was some dialogue, and for example on the terms of corruption, which is a problem for Russia, and so on and so forth. The main thing is that Russia wouldn't like to be patronized, and I do not think I could explain it to Mr. Obama how. I mean, you need to put yourself all the time. Every time you need to put yourself on the Russian perspective. Why this specific issue could be seen as patronizing for Russia, but to avoid patronizing, and patronizing, first of all, is seen when there is a pressure on the human rights, especially if it goes blaming, you know, saying kind of on public these very heated words.
Thank you very much. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there are significant unresolved issues left over from the past in Russia and government. Can you tell us a little bit more from your perspective what those are? Because I think you would like to.
Well, I didn't mean the unresolved issues from the. I mean the issues of identity when I was talking about. I didn't mean the issues, unresolved issues, specifically with the region and some kind of regional conflicts, which are numerous. I mean, it's kind of. But I was mentioning more of kind of discussion who we are and where we are going, because it's still, you know, in Russia still. No, less I think, but still it is debated: was Peter I the right kind of Tsar or not? Yeah, I mean, was he right or wrong? And it's dating back to the 18th century, and of course everything which deals with the 20th century, with the revolution and Stalin, and you know, all this kind of stuff. And people, there is still discussion, very heated. I mean, you know, what was the Soviet past? Because, you know, it's easy to say to some Western countries that the Soviet past it was just some black period, and the communism was wrong, and what was done was wrong. When your father, your grandfather, he lived most of the time in this period. And you cannot tell him that for most part of his life he was doing a wrong life. He was kind of, he was stupid actually, right? And you cannot say it to the intelligent people, to the people who work, but also to the people who were in the academia, who were in institutions, in universities, who were then doing a lot of even technical job, but who were believing in that this kind of part of the bigger future life. What do you think, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
Especially with the recent billions of dollars that were towards public policy on digital devices. Now Russia's project self-market is actually running budget. How do you think it feels so far?
You know, apart from having money, I think this is what we have learned in the last 2 decades. Apart from having money, you need to have expertise, competences. And I
think that one part of the problem that we throughout the last decade, there was still the learning process. I mean, it was the learning process also in terms of foreign policy in general. Like in first there was what's called period of democratic solidarity. Then came period of Russia saying no, when it was Russia started to say when it disagrees and on what it disagrees, but it wasn't often often its partners didn't follow this, partly because Russia didn't provide anything instead of this, right? It would telling we don't agree with you on this issue, on kind of on for example, I don't know, on Kosovo. What to do with Kosovo? There was no answer. And then in the 2000s, Russians started to learn how to do this. And I think now, and this initiative which is proposed is something that we have learned to do. And the same thing happens with the public diplomacy, but it's just, it started 10 years later. Russian diplomacy started from 1991 to much extent, though of course there was success of the Soviet system, but the Soviet system was so much different in terms of foreign policy decision making that it's kind of not always relevant, but sometimes relevant. And the public diplomacy is just from the middle 2000s. And I know that there are some very successful stories, for example, Russia Behind the Headlines, which is kind of the product attached to the Western newspapers. You could get it every month. And the quality of articles is very good, and it's not propaganda. It's just talking to people and discussing who we are and who we are not. On the other hand, I know that, for example, Russia Today is not high appreciated. I mean, we have, I don't know why, but we have now a canteen, Russia Today in MGIMO all the time. And I understand there is everything, something about the United States. I have never seen there's something about Russia. It's kind of disturbing me, for example. But I think that, I mean, the people who are dealing with public policy, public image, I think they explain sometimes what's the strategy and what's behind it. But just for me, it's a bit strange. But there are good projects. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, I would like to thank you very much. That was very interesting. I hope you're writing this up somewhere, and we will hope to welcome you back. We may have another MGIMO series conference in the spring, and certainly the students who are here who are in my foreign policy class will have a joint class with
That would be great.
your teaching. So
Yeah.
maybe we can discuss this more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.